In the previous videos, we saw that powerful historical evidence exists for the following 6 facts. 1. Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. 2. His tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers the following Sunday morning. 3. That the 12 disciples both claimed and believed that they saw Jesus alive shortly after his death. 4. That a church persecutor named Paul converted to Christianity on the basis of what he perceived to be an appearance of the risen Jesus. 5. A skeptic named James converted to Christianity on the basis of what he perceived to be an appearance of the risen Jesus. And 6. That the very origins of the Christian faith in the first century was unique. It was a rare messianic movement. These are 6 facts that are granted by nearly every historian and scholar who studies the subject, even the non-Christian ones. For example, Ehrman, Ludemann, Sanders. These are the minimal facts. And in the introduction of this series, I said that the case for the resurrection of Jesus involved 2 steps. The first step is figuring out what the facts are, and the second step is discerning what the best explanation of those facts are. We accomplished the first step in parts 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now we come to the second step. What is the best explanation for the 6 aforementioned facts? Over the past 2 millennia, skeptics have proposed dozens of naturalistic theories to try to account for the minimal facts. Let's look at them and see if any of them work. I've opted to address these naturalistic theories in the order in which these theories started appearing in the literature throughout history. I'll address the very earliest proposal, and then I'll talk about the most recently proposed theories. Now, what is the criteria for the best explanation? In his book, Justifying Historical Descriptions, C.B. McCullough puts forth several criteria which historians use for assessing historical theories. These criteria are 1. Explanatory scope, 2. Explanatory power, 3. Plausibility, 4. Not being ad hoc or contrived, 5. Being in agreement with established beliefs, and 6. Outstripping its rival theories. I'm going to argue that the hypothesis Jesus miraculously rose from the dead, or God raised Jesus from the dead, passes every single one of these tests with flying colors, while the same cannot be said at all of the various naturalistic theories that non-Christians propose to try to explain these minimal facts. Any best explanation has to meet these 6 criteria. So let's start looking at the explanations. The first explanation is the stolen body theory. Theory 1, the stolen body theory, the disciples' version. You'll recall from part 2 in this series, or part 3 rather, that this is the explanation the Jewish leadership came up with to account for the empty tomb in Matthew 28. The Jewish leaders paid off the Roman guards to tell people that the disciples came in the middle of the night to steal the body. That's the explanation that's being given here. The disciples stole the body, hid it somewhere, and then ran around telling everyone, oh, he is risen, he's alive, he's risen from the dead, he's not dead anymore. And if anyone skeptical of the claim wanted to check it out for themselves, they'd go down to the tomb and find the body gone. Then the disciples could say, "See, I told you." Hermann Samuel Ramirez popularized this theory in the 1760s. Of all the naturalistic theories, I find this to be one of the weakest. Recall from the video on the postmortem appearances to the disciples that church history is unanimous in saying that all of the disciples, with the possible exception of John, died horrible, gruesome deaths for proclaiming that Jesus rose from the dead. James, the brother of John, was beheaded by decree of King Herod Agrippa. Peter was crucified upside down. Thomas was speared to death in India. Matthew died by being dragged by a horse. Philip was crucified on an X-shaped cross. You can see on the screen here the list of historical sources that record the various different martyrdoms. The disciples could have saved themselves simply by recanting. Yet they proclaimed the resurrection of Jesus despite agonizing, brutal torture, despite forfeiting their lives. Why would they do that? Why would they die for a lie? Now again, when you bring this point up to skeptics, they'll say, but that doesn't prove the resurrection is true any more than Muslims giving up their lives in acts of jihad prove that Islam is true. And they're right, I totally agree with them. But they're missing the point. I am not saying that the disciples' martyrdom proves that Jesus rose from the dead. What I am saying is that it proves that they believed he rose from the dead. Martyrdom doesn't prove the disciples were right. It just proves that they sincerely believed what they were saying. To put it another way, people will die for a lie that they think is true, but no one will die for a lie that they know is false. People will die for a lie only if they really believe that it's true. But they will not die for a lie if they are consciously aware of the fact that it is a lie. And that is the fatal flaw in the stolen body theory. It posits that the disciples stole Jesus' body and deliberately tried to deceive the masses, and then they willingly endured beatings, torture, and execution for preaching what they consciously knew was not true. The late Charles Colson, who did prison time for being an accomplice in Watergate but who later became a Christian, wrote this, quote, "Watergate involved a conspiracy to cover up, perpetuated by the closest aide to the President of the United States, the most powerful men in America who were intensely loyal to their president. But one of them, John Dean, turned state's evidence, that is, testified against Nixon, as he put it, to save his own skin. And he did so only 2 weeks after informing the president about what was really going on. 2 weeks. The real cover-up, the lie, could only be held together for 2 weeks, and then everybody else jumped ship in order to save themselves." Now, the fact is that all that those around the president were facing was embarrassment, maybe prison. Nobody's life was at stake. But what about the disciples? 12 powerless men, peasants really, were facing not just embarrassment or political disgrace, but beatings, stonings, and execution. Every single one of the disciples insisted, to their dying breaths, that they had physically seen Jesus bodily raised from the dead. Don't you think that one of those apostles would have cracked before being beheaded or stoned? That one of them would have made a deal with the authorities? None did. End quote. As if the unreasonableness of positing that the disciples willingly suffered and died for a lie wasn't bad enough. This theory has other issues. For one thing, we've seen that Paul and James converted to Christianity because they believed they saw the risen Jesus. This theory cannot account for their conversion experiences. So this theory fails because 1, the disciples died for preaching the resurrection. Liars make poor martyrs. 2, it doesn't explain why Paul believed he saw Jesus post-crucifixion. If the disciples stole the body and hid it, how did this persecutor, Paul, get involved? And 3, it doesn't explain why James believes he saw Jesus post-crucifixion. Theory 2. The stolen body theory, other person version. People who realize you can't implicate the disciples in stealing Jesus' body, since it's impossible for hoaxers to sincerely believe their own hoax, modify the stolen body theory a bit. Instead of saying the disciples stole the body, they say someone else stole the body. The problems with this theory are numerous. First, we've seen that the disciples sincerely believed they saw the risen Jesus appear to them. They claimed and believed that Jesus appeared to them. Second, Saul of Tarsus, aka Paul, went from being a Christian killer to a Christian maker because he thought he saw the risen Jesus appear to him on the road to Damascus. Thirdly, the skeptic James converted because he believed he saw Jesus alive after his death. This modified version of the stolen body theory, which is called Fraud B by Gary Habermas, can't explain any of the post-mortem appearance experiences. The only minimal fact that it can account for is the empty tomb. Besides that, it's not plausible. Because who would have a motive to steal the body of Jesus anyway? We already know we can't implicate the disciples. Liars make poor martyrs. Was it the Romans? What business would they have plucking Jesus' body out of the tomb and then hiding it somewhere? Was it the Pharisees? The body being snatched is precisely what they were trying to stop. That's why they had guards situated outside the tomb. So, who exactly is supposed to be the culprit here? Theory 3. The wrong tomb theory. This naturalistic theory comes to you courtesy of Kersop Lake. This theory states that on that first Easter morning, the women went down to the wrong tomb and concluded on that basis that Jesus had risen from the dead. The whole thing was really just a simple misunderstanding. Jesus' tomb wasn't empty. They just went to the wrong tomb. The tomb never had a body in it at all. There are quite a few problems with this view. First off, the wrong tomb theory expects us to believe that everyone who would have been interested in the tomb totally forgot where it was. Not only did the women go down to the wrong tomb, but later John and Peter went to the wrong tomb. And then the Pharisees also went to the wrong tomb, followed by the Romans who went to the wrong tomb, and of course Joseph of Arimathea went to the wrong tomb because he must have forgotten where the tomb that he owned was located. This is beyond implausible. But even more devastating to the theory is that it doesn't explain the beliefs of the disciples, James, or Paul that they had seen the risen Jesus. We've already seen in previous videos that there's good evidence that the disciples, James, and Paul believed that they saw the risen Jesus appear to them. So this theory fails because, 1, it is not plausible. The tomb's location was well known, and it's extremely unlikely everyone interested in the tomb forgot where it was. And 2, it doesn't have adequate explanatory scope. The disciples didn't believe Jesus rose because the tomb was empty, but because they believed Jesus appeared to them. Theory 4, the swoon theory. Friedrich Schleiermacher put this theory forth in his book On Religion, Speeches to Its Culture's Despisers in 1799. This theory says that maybe Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. Maybe he merely fainted on the cross, and then later the cool, damp air of the tomb sort of roused him around into consciousness. He later appeared to his disciples, not because he had risen from the dead, but because he never died in the first place. This theory seeks to explain minimal facts 2 through 6 by denying minimal fact 1. Was Jesus crucified? Yes, proponents of this theory would say. Was he dead when the Romans took him down from the cross? The proponents of this theory would say no. First of all, given the nature of pre-crucifixion scourging and of the crucifixion itself, it is extremely unlikely that a crucifixion victim could walk away alive. When a to-be-crucified person was scourged, they would be given 40 lashes. History tells us that the Roman 40 lashes were from a whip of braided leather thongs with metal balls, broken pieces of sheep bone, broken glass, and basically anything sharp that would cut a person. These sharp pieces of sheep bone, metal, and broken glass were woven into the braided leather thongs. When the whip would strike the flesh, the metal balls would cause severe bruising, and the sheep bone and broken glass would cut the flesh severely. You can easily imagine how shredded a person's back would be after being cut in 40 different places with multiple blades. According to Dr. Alexander Metherell, the cuts and forces of the beating could shred the back so much that the spine of the victim was sometimes exposed. The whipping would have gone all the way down the shoulders to the back and the back of the legs. One physician who studied Roman beatings said, quote, "As the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh," end quote. Eusebius, a 3rd century historian, described scourging with the following words, quote, "The sufferer's veins were laid bare, and the very muscles, sinews, and bowels of the victim were open to exposure," end quote. The result of such a hellish beating would mean that Jesus would very likely go into hypovolemic shock. Hypovolemic shock is caused by severe blood loss. It causes 4 symptoms to occur. First, the heart races in a desperate attempt to replace all the blood that was lost. Second, the blood pressure plummets, bringing about fainting or collapsing. Third, the kidneys stop making urine in an attempt to preserve what little liquid is left in the body. And fourth, the person gets very, very thirsty. When you read the gospel accounts of Jesus' execution, all of the symptoms of hypovolemic shock are present. For example, at one point, Jesus falls while carrying his cross, and Simon of Cyrene is forced to help Jesus carry his cross the rest of the way. Later, when Jesus was on the cross, he said, "I thirst," and then a Roman soldier dipped a sponge in vinegar and stuck it up to Jesus' mouth for him to drink. See John chapter 19, verses 28 to 29. Jesus was in critical condition even before he was crucified. Jesus then carried his cross to the site of the crucifixion, and the Romans nailed him to it. Now, how does crucifixion kill its victims? Scientific experiments have been done on volunteers to test what the effects of hanging on a cross would have. These were controlled circumstances, so there was no real danger of these people being harmed. While these volunteers were hanging on the cross, they would mention having difficulty breathing. They would have to push up and down in order to breathe. Eventually, they'd get too exhausted to push up and down anymore, so the scientists would take the person down off the cross at the volunteers' request. What these experiments showed was that crucifixion victims die from suffocation. Once Jesus was hanging vertically, the weight of his body and the position of his arms put great stress on the diaphragm and would put his chest in an inhaled position. So in order to exhale, Jesus would have to push up on his feet to take a breath. Finally, with the pressure on his chest eased, he'd be able to come back down and inhale. Then he'd push back up to exhale, and then he would come back down to inhale. And then he would go back up to exhale, and then he would come back down to inhale. And this would happen over and over and over and over until eventually exhaustion takes over, and he could no longer push himself up to breathe and die of asphyxiation. Now, the Roman soldiers would have known when a crucified person was finally dead on the basis that they would see that their victims weren't pushing up to breathe any longer. Now, at this point, the proponent of the swoon theory might say, well, maybe Jesus stopped pushing up on purpose in order to fool the soldiers, to make them think, oh, I'm not pushing up anymore, so I must be dead. You can take me down now. And that this was his plan to escape being killed by crucifixion. That's not plausible. You can't fake that. You can't do that for very long. You just can't sag there and not push up for a very long time. Not only that, but the Romans were no fools. I know that a lot of skeptics, they usually think that people thousands of years ago were very stupid and gullible, but they weren't. And it's very, very arrogant of them to think so. If anyone tried to fake death by pushing up, the Romans would know it. They'd just wait a little while to see if the person was playing possum or not. When the Romans wanted to speed up death, they'd break the legs of the people on the crosses with a massive club. Then, as a result of having their legs shattered, they wouldn't be able to push up and breathe, and death would come quickly. However, and we see this in the gospel accounts, the soldiers broke the legs of the 2 thieves hanging there with Jesus. But they didn't do this to Jesus because they saw that he was already dead. but just to make sure, they drove a spear through him. It punctured both his heart and his lung. And the Gospel of John tells us that when the soldier did that, blood and water gushed out. John chapter 19, verse 34. This single fact proves not only that Jesus was dead, but it also tells us what he died of. Heart failure due to shock and constriction of the heart detected by the presence of fluid in the pericardium. In this instance, the heart has ceased beating. This brought about an accumulation of fluid in Jesus' heart, which is called pericardial effusion, and in addition, it also brought about a collection of fluid in the lungs, which is called pleural effusion. These two fluids cannot be present if the person's heart is still beating. And by the way, for those who want to doubt John's description of the blood and water, I have this to say to you. We have excellent reason to believe that John is telling the truth here. For one thing, John was an uneducated fisherman. Do you think that he would have known about pericardial effusion and pleural effusion? Of course not. While anyone would expect to see a pierced body gush blood, not many, even today, would expect clear fluid to come out. So, despite being mentioned in only one source, we still have a good reason to believe this description is true. And in addition to this, a Roman author named Quintilian records an instance of Romans piercing a crucified body to check that to see if it was dead. So that increases the plausibility of John's account even more. So this theory really fails in explanatory power. It was impossible for Jesus to survive this whole ordeal. For one thing, Jesus was in hypovolemic shock from the pre-crucifixion scourging alone. Jesus was in critical condition even on his way to the cross, so he would have bled out eventually. 2, but if the bleeding didn't kill him, he would have eventually died of suffocation. And 3, if neither of those two things got to him first, we can be sure Jesus was dead by the time that the Roman pierced him through the chest with a spear. For one thing, you can't survive a spear jab to the heart. And number 2, the spear jab revealed Jesus' heart and lungs collected pericardial effusion and pleural effusion, which cannot be present if the heart is still beating. But let's suppose that the medically impossible did occur. Let's suppose that against all medical odds, Jesus somehow survived the aforementioned hell on earth. The non-Christian David Strauss explains that, quote, "It is impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, who crept about weak and ill and wanting medical treatment, could have given the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life, an impression that lay at the bottom of their future ministry," end quote. Again, ancient people were not stupid. If Jesus, having gone through that hellacious torture, had appeared at the door of the disciples, do you know what they would have done? I can just imagine it. Peter would have been like, "Andrew, John, get some towels, get a bucket of water. Our friend he survived, but he's in danger. He needs medical treatment right away. Get some doctors. Go get Luke. Get the best that Jerusalem has to offer. This is our best friend here. We got to save him." That's what they would have thought if Jesus had survived the medically impossible odds. And this is what a non-Christian David Strauss is saying. Now, I also want to point out that in Josephus's writings, Josephus records that while he was out and about, he saw that 3 of his friends were hanging on the cross. He was able to get them down, and 2 of all of his friends got the best medical treatment that Rome had to offer. But yet 2 of them still died, even though they were taken off the cross prematurely and they were given the best medical treatment that Rome had to offer. Only the 3rd one managed to recover. Unlike Jesus, who wasn't taken down prematurely and he wasn't given any medical treatment. I just don't find this theory believable. It's not a good naturalistic hypothesis. Let's look at theory number 5, the hallucination theory. This is probably the most popular of the naturalistic theories among scholars today. I mean, Bart Ehrman holds it, Gerd Ludemann holds it, a lot of skeptical scholars hold it. It's just their go-to. This theory says that the appearances to the disciples, Paul and James, were all hallucinations. They believed they saw Jesus. Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead, though. He didn't actually stand before them. It was just their minds playing tricks on them. So, what do we do with this theory? Is this a good theory? I don't think so. The biggest problem with the theory is, as any psychologist will tell you, hallucinations are occurrences that happen in the minds of individuals. They're similar to dreams in this way. Imagine a group of your friends came up to you one day and said, "Boy, that was one nice dream last night that we all had, didn't we?" You would probably think that they were pulling a practical joke on you. You would never take seriously their claim that they all simultaneously had the exact same dream. This is because dreams are individual occurrences. By their very nature of the case, they cannot be shared experiences. Hallucinations are the same way. Now, the extremely early creed I talked about in a previous video of this series tells us that Jesus appeared to several groups of people. He appeared to all of the original disciples. He appeared individually to James. He appeared individually to Paul. He appeared to 500 individuals at one time, and he appeared to the disciples again later. There were multiple group experiences and a few individual appearance experiences. Now, do Ludemann and Ehrman honestly expect me to believe that they all hallucinated? They all had the exact same hallucination? Impossible. It's impossible for 500 individuals to have the exact same hallucination at exactly the same time. This would be almost as likely as the entire state of South Carolina having the same dream on the same night. But Jesus didn't just appear to 500 individuals at one time. He appeared to multiple groups on multiple different occasions. People indoors and outdoors. People with different personalities. People with different mindsets. Hard-headed people like Peter. Soft-hearted people like Mary. He appeared to the 12 disciples in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, at least on 2 different occasions in that creed. Do Ludemann and Ehrman honestly expect me to believe that multiple groups of people on multiple different occasions all had the exact same hallucination? Now, moreover, not only are group multimode hallucinations statistically impossible, but hallucinations of any kind are uncommon. Hallucinations are usually induced by sleep deprivation, drugs, a high fever, or mental instability. If none of these 4 factors are present, it's highly unlikely that you're going to have a hallucination. Now, as far as we know, none of the disciples, Paul or James, were insomniacs, sick, crazy, or druggies. So they just weren't probably in the likely state of mind to have hallucinations. Now, if you want to go down the route that these were grief hallucinations, these were hallucinations brought on by the disciples being grief-stricken, Well, okay, it's still extremely improbable that all grief-stricken people in the same room at the same time are going to hallucinate the dead loved one being there. Maybe one would, maybe two would, but a dozen people? And what about Saul of Tarsus? He certainly wasn't grief-stricken over the death of Jesus. He hated Jesus. He was persecuting Jesus' followers because he believed that they were heretics. Now, with Jesus' brother James, it's a little bit harder to pin down. If James thought, and he did, that Jesus was a crazy heretic, that might have curbed any dislike of Jesus' execution that he might have had. He might have thought that the Pharisees were justified because his brother was a blasphemer, supposedly. But being his brother, we could still imagine that he still would have been sad over it. It's a little bit harder to pin down whether James was grief-stricken, but Saul of Tarsus was certainly not. So, the hallucination theory just really, although it's really popular, it's a stinker. Theory 6, the groupthink theory. Some skeptics have considered that perhaps the disciples were so in anticipation of Jesus' return that they talked themselves into it. One day they went to the tomb and John was like, "Hey, Peter, over there, I think that's Jesus. Over there, do you see him?" And Peter was like, "Oh, yeah, I think I see him. Yeah, I think I do." And they just kind of talked themselves into it. Well, this couldn't be the case either. Why? Because you have to be in anticipation that you're going to experience something like that. You have to be primed for it. They weren't. Remember in part 6 of this series, I talked about how the origin of the Christian faith was weird. It just wasn't something that anyone would have made up, much less sincerely believed. I mentioned some of these in the previous video. 1. Jesus died. Jews weren't expecting a dying Messiah, but a Messiah who would be a conquering warrior king, one who would throw off the yoke of Rome. 2. According to the Old Testament, which Jews call the Tanakh, anyone hung on a tree was under God's curse. This is mentioned in Deuteronomy 21:23. Now, since Roman crosses were made out of wood, they were technically trees. So people would often speak of the crucified as being hung on a tree. And since this was in the minds of Jews, the way in which Jesus died would have only served to convince the disciples that Caiaphas and the others were right in condemning Jesus as a blasphemer and a heretic. 3. The Jews believed that all people would rise from the dead at the end of the world, but they never expected any isolated person to get out of their grave right smack dab in the middle of human history. 4. Some of the people who experienced a sighting of the risen Jesus were skeptics. James and Paul. These two were not in any way expecting Jesus to come back to life. And I would also add 5. Why didn't any of the other messianic movements of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries have this kind of groupthink experience? Say Simon Bar Giora's followers. Why didn't they start talking amongst themselves, "Hey, I think Simon might be raised from the dead. I think I see his shadow over there." It's just not very good. Let's look at naturalistic theory number 7, the Pauline conversion disorder theory. I found out about this theory from Habermas's and Licona's popular work, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, and this theory argues that Paul's conversion from skepticism was a result of conversion disorder. Conversion disorder is a neurological malfunction that occurs whenever a major change comes into someone's life. This is what Habermas and Licona write in their book. Quote, "Let us suppose that the year is 1968. A young American named Rick has been drafted into the U.S. Army for a tour in Vietnam. Shortly after he receives his letter from the Department of the Defense, Rick begins to feel a sharp pain all the way down his right leg. The pain worsens, and by the time he goes for his military physical, he is limping severely. In this case, Rick is not faking the pain in order to get out of going to Vietnam. he may have conversion disorder. Typical symptoms of conversion disorder are blindness, paralysis, loss of voice, pain, uncontrolled vomiting, tics, and seizures." End quote. All of these are temporary, of course, as conversion does not last forever. Could Paul have experienced something like this? He did experience temporary blindness at the moment he saw a bright light and thought he saw Jesus. See Acts chapter 9. Could Paul have experienced a neurological malfunction? This theory is plagued with several problems, not the least of which is that it only addresses Paul's conversion and nothing else. It doesn't explain the empty tomb. It doesn't explain the post-mortem appearances to the disciples or the appearance to James. The resurrection hypothesis explains all of these. But moreover, Paul is unlikely to have experienced conversion disorder anyway. According to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSMIV, women are more likely to have conversion disorder than men by as much as a 5-to-1 ratio. Adolescents, military combatants, and those with a low IQ are also more likely to experience the disorder. Paul doesn't fall into any of these categories. Paul is not a woman, a teenager, a warrior, or a dummy. This doesn't mean he couldn't have experienced the disorder. After all, women are also more likely to experience depression than men, and yet there are men who experience depression. But this does make it unlikely. And when you look at all of the other problems associated with the Pauline conversion disorder theory, it makes it even more unlikely. Not only must we employ conversion disorder to explain Paul's experience, we must also say that Paul experienced an auditory hallucination as well as a Messiah complex. Why? Because Paul not only saw a bright light and went blind, but he also heard a voice that told him to spread the gospel. Now, it is possible to find people who have experienced conversion disorder, auditory hallucinations, and a Messiah complex, but it's extremely rare to find people who have simultaneously experienced all three. So, well guys, this video is about 40 minutes long, so I think I'm going to cut it off here and have a part 2 to talk about the rest of the naturalistic theories. I want to spend a good amount of time on two versions of the legend theory. One of them is embellishment. The other one is Jesus is just a copycat of pagan deities. I want to spend a good time on those two because most skeptical lay people bring that theory up, and want to spend a good amount of time debunking that because it's just rampant on the internet. So, until the next time, keep using the brains that God gave you. Oh, and by the way, leave a like, subscribe, and become a patron. And speaking of patrons, here's the shout out page.